good morning to everybody. I'm really honored to chair the first panel of this conference devoted to the theme of the Greek Revolution, slavery and politics of race. And the first speaker is Professor Lilia Diamantopoulou, who's professor of modern Greek studies at Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. And Lilia's research focuses on multimediality, diaspora studies, Black history in the Eastern Mediterranean. And she's a women's representative at the Department of Cultural Studies at the University of Munich. And she's also a board member of the Munich Center of Ancient Worlds, and the board member of the German Association for Modern Greek Studies, as well as of the Palladian Foundation in Munich. And in 2021, Lilia won the prestigious Ludwig Maximilians University Innovation Teaching Award for a seminar and project about the objects of revolution. And Lilia is today going to talk about fighting for freedom, the Black experience in the Greek independence war. Lilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to talk from there.
Wonderful. You have 20 minutes.
Yeah, I try. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks to the organizers and especially to Michalis Sotiropoulos for inviting me to this super interesting conference and also putting my talk about Black history in Greece at the beginning as an initial talk. So my title, Fighting for Freedom, the Black Experience and the Greek Independence War. I'm putting my clock because I need to know the time. Okay, let's start. During the first century of Greece's history, soldiers from various backgrounds fought to establish what is now known as modern Greece. Black soldiers were among them, but their stories and numbers are often overlooked. Where did they come from? How many were they? What are their stories? For which side did they fight? There are few monographs and articles in research that deal with the Black diaspora in the Eastern Mediterranean, but these groups have never really been in the focus. My current research project on Black history in Greece will try to fill some of the gaps. A majority of the African individuals were forcibly migrated to the Eastern Mediterranean and arrived to the Ottoman Empire and the young modern Greek state via the trans-Saharan slave trade. Enslaved individuals were employed in a range of tasks, including domestic duties within households, agricultural labor on, for example, sugar cane and cotton plantations, industrial work in factories, and extracting salt or gold from mines. Additionally, some enslaved individuals were also forced to serve as soldiers. The practice of trading slaves from sub-Saharan Africa to Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean dates back to ancient times. In the Ottoman period, the sale of slaves in Cairo, which was the primary market for slaves in Egypt, was closely monitored for taxation purposes. It's worth noting that a separate market was used to sell white slaves. While the abolitionist movement in America officially banned the slave trade in 1865, it was during this time that the practice of slavery thrived in Egypt, which is probably something connected. Cairo, Alexandria, Benghazi, and Tripoli were the primary forwarding markets for the trade into the Ottoman Mediterranean. The peak of the slave trade to the Ottoman Empire was in the last third of the century, with an estimated 11,000 African slaves annually arriving via Tripoli, the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Egypt. This translates to approximately 300 63,000 trans-Saharan Africans arriving in the empire during that time. Some of the slaves were directed to Cretan and other ports and settled on the island, which in the mid-19th century had a significant black population. Islamic law recognized and regulated the practice of slavery with a legalistic framework governing the rights of both slaves and their masters. The criticism of slavery in the Muslim East by Europeans grew stronger following its abolition in the British and French empires in 1838 and 1848, respectively. Muslim defenders of slavery viewed this criticism as an attack on their culture and family and argued that Muslim slavery was comparatively less harmful. The Anglo-Egyptian Convention on the Abolition of Slavery officially banned the African slave trade to Egypt in 1877, and a ban on importing white slaves was implemented 7 years later. It was only in 1891 when official certificates of manumission were not published in the newspapers, were published in the newspapers in Crete. We can see it here on the screen. Trans-Saharan slave soldiers who fought for the Ottoman Egyptian forces in Morea are well known for shaping the image of the cruel black man in literature and art. This image raised concerns among some Philhellenists, such as Chateaubriand in Notes sur la Grèce, 1825, who feared that the victory of black soldiers would threaten the whiteness of Greece. In Chateaubriand's description of his journey to Peloponnese, he notes that in the midst of the birthplace of art and freedom, the Greek race would be extinguished and replaced by the race of black slaves. These and similar travel descriptions, among others, motivated the Allies to intervene decisively in the battle and side with the Greeks, and needs to be discussed as an expression of white supremacy. But let's get one step back. How did the sub-Saharan slaves came to the Peloponnese? The ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, continued the tradition of strengthening the army with black recruits, but on a larger scale. He invaded Sudan in 1820 with the primary objective of forcibly conscripting men to serve in his new regiments, which he aimed to train in modern style. Around the same time, the Greek War of Independence began. By the early 1820s, approximately 24,000 troops, predominantly black and commanded by white Mamluk officers, were fully prepared for action. These forces comprised the majority of the troops sent to the Morea to suppress the Greek independence war. In early 1825, Muhammad Ali began constructing this military force of enslaved soldiers. He organized 6 brigades comprising of Sudanese slaves and Mamluk officers and dispatched them to various battlefronts in Arabia, Syria, Greece, and the Sudan itself. Of these 6 brigades, 4 were sent to Greece, and we know from historical records that they were trained in a camp and learned Turkish. It is remarkable that government slaves were stamped on the arm and couldn't be sold again. The first army that Muhammad Ali sent to Greece in 1824 consisted of those 4 brigades that numbered some 16,000 Sudanese slave soldiers. Later on, another force arrived. According to a letter from the Austrian consul in Greece to Chancellor Metternich, the second contingent of Egyptian forces that landed on April 30, 1825, included 2,000 horsemen and 11,000 infantry soldiers, with 8,000 of them being Sudanese slaves, or Negroes, as the consul describes them. Accordingly, during the war, Ibrahim Pasha's personal guard was made up of 500 to 800 Sudanese soldiers. Further reinforcements had to be sent to assist the 4 brigades, consisting primarily of Egyptian peasants. In total, the Egyptian forces in Greece eventually numbered around 42,000, composed of Sudanese, Turkish, and Egyptian soldiers. The war situation also emerges from Greek sources, for example, in Kolokotronis' memoirs, where he mentions the immense troop size. He counts a total amount of 50,000 soldiers of the Egyptians and the constant supply of soldiers. I'm citing his narration. Each province took care of its defense. After all, the place was deserted. War did not allow cultivation. We could not find bread, and the government was only in name because they also didn't have and couldn't send us anything. We lived for 20 or 30 days with only straw, green wheat, and meat. And if we made war and lost 4,000 or 5,000 men, it was impossible to recreate an army, while if there were lost 10 to 15,000 damned Arabs, Ibrahim would bring others. During the war between 1824 and 1828, it is believed that 71%, or approximately 30,000 of the soldiers, died due to the brutality and cruelty of the conflict. Only about 2,000 to 3,000 returned to Egypt. Historians suspect that the especially high mortality rate of the Sudanese soldiers was due to the unusually cold climate and harsh terrain in Crete and the Peloponnese, which was unfamiliar to them, particularly in the winter when the mountains were covered in snow. Others refer to homesickness as a death reason. I would argue that more devastating than the climate difference was likely the fact that the immune systems of the Sudanese soldiers were not accustomed to the European diseases that were prevalent, especially during the winter. In addition to the usual winter illnesses, Europe was also experiencing outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and diphtheria. It is also reported that the troops suffered from an eye disease. We can assume that this refers to the so-called Egyptian eye disease, the trachoma, which is caused by a bacterium and whose symptoms range from pain to blindness. Besides that, it's also very possible that the Sudanese soldiers were captured and left behind or just deserted. When the trans-Saharan Africans left, what did they leave back? What are the traces these trans-Saharan slave soldiers left behind? We can observe different types of traces. On the one hand, there are official written sources as registrations, records, and contracts that can provide clues to their presence and activities, like from the military archives of Egypt or the Ottoman Empire. However, these sources are often incomplete or non-existent, particularly with regard to the African soldiers and their individual stories. Another way to follow the traces of these soldiers is through literary sources, such as poems, stories, and memoirs written, for example, by Greek heroes of the liberation struggle, like the memoirs of Kolokotronis mentioned before. In these texts, we can gain insights to the relationships between the African soldiers and the Greeks and learn how they were perceived. Visual sources, such as oil paintings and drawings, can also provide clues to the presence of African soldiers. These representations can show us how the soldiers were depicted and what role they played in the battles. However, these sources have been little studied in research, and their interpretation can be difficult. Finally, there are some objects left behind by the soldiers during the naval battle of Navarino, where the Greeks' allies, Britain, France, Russia, destroyed the Egyptian fleet. Egyptian military equipment was captured. As a result of this battle, a large amount of military equipment from the Egyptians was obtained, including some items from Arabia, East Africa, and particularly from Sudan. Examples of this type of objects include also weapons, war maces, standards, and batons of command, as you can see here in the screen. These objects were placed into private collections belonging to individuals from Britain, America, Greece, and were presented in some articles. The exploration of the traces left by these soldiers requires an interdisciplinary approach that combines various sources and methods to obtain a comprehensive picture. But let's now take a look to the other side of the battlefield. Also, on the other side of the battlefield, people with Afro-diasporic roots fought for independence alongside the revolutionary heroes or on the side of the allies, like the African-American James Jacob Williams. We don't have a picture of him. James Jacob Williams was an African-American from Baltimore, Maryland in the USA. He served as a Marine in the US Navy. In his capacity, he participated in the war between the US and Algeria that took place in 1815. At the end of the operations in Algeria, he went to Greece. Williams arrived in Greece in January 1827 and was appointed assistant to the British Philhellenes Admiral Thomas Cochrane. Williams took part in various battles and naval battles too, and was seriously injured by the cannon fracture in his arm and leg. He died in 1829 in Greece. The traveler Jonathan Miller wrote about him, I'm citing. Went to see a black man, James Williams, from the United States, who had an arm and leg broken in the engagement with the Turks in the Gulf of Lepanto. I gave him $2 to enable him to pay off his nurse and promised to move him to the hospital. Took James Williams into my house. Williams came to Greece with Lord Concrete as cook and conducted himself with great coolness. Particularly at the Battle of at the Gulf of Lepanto, for when no Greek could be found to take the helm, Williams volunteered his services and was there struck down. He had before contended with the Turks, for he had lost a finger before in Algiers. There is a book written by Kostas Rethymiotakis in 2021. It's called The Fantastic Story of James Williams, To Breathe, to Believe. It is a fictionalized historical novel about the life and adventures of an Afro-American soldier fighting in the Greek Independence War. It is a book about an odyssey of a man born as a slave who reaches the pinnacle of heroism in a land far away from his roots. And yet, his adventures, while approaching a mythical status, pale in comparison to the emotional growth Williams undergoes. Slave to sailor, to spy, to battle-hardened hero, to shipwreck victim, to lover, to seeker of truth, and finally to a moment of enlightenment in his physical death. At this point, when he dies, a new journey starts, one in which James Williams, now as an unknown traveler, meets Mandela, Martin Luther King, Jesse Owens, and Maya Angelou in their childhoods, when all of them are living anonymously in deprivation. His simple but profound advice will influence their futures, transforming them into heroes. So let's go back to the historical description. In terms of numbers, of course, those diasporic Africans are not as many as Ibrahim's soldiers, and they were not forcibly resettled in the frame of an army of slaves. It is said that the Afro-Greeks in Thrace were descendants of these sub-Saharan slave soldiers of Ibrahim, but further research on this topic is needed. Also, further research is needed on the role of Afro-Albanians and Afro-Montenegrins, who also fought for independence from the Ottoman Empire. You can see here some pictures of them, photographs of the end of 19th century. Sometimes we see them wearing the fustanella, sometimes they're wearing the traditional trousers, as evidenced by photographs, sketches, and oil paintings. Also, another one. The sources primarily present the perspective of an outsider, often a white European traveler, when depicting these individuals. This limits the representation of the individuals themselves and their experiences, making it crucial to prioritize sources that amplify their voices. One such example is a collection of official letters of request to the Greek government, which are available in the Greek state archives and offer valuable insights into the individual's perspectives. It is important to recognize that historical sources are not always comprehensive in their portrayal of marginalized community. Often, these community stories are told by outsiders, leading to a one-sided narrative that may not accurately reflect their experiences. As such, researchers must prioritize and seek out sources that provide a more inclusive and diverse perspective, giving voice to those who have been historically silenced. 18. I would like to read only one of these letters and at the same time conclude my presentation. It is written by Karagiorgis, who calls himself a Kahabeshi, that is an Ethiopian, in December 1830, addressing the head of state Ioannis Kapodistrias, who was murdered 1 year later and succeeded by his brother Augustinus, who is also mentioned in the letter. The most interesting is the Black experience of the Independence War and the years after, and the difficulties somebody like him, of different race and color, as he says, without a family and a friend network, faces in modern Greece. I'm reading the letter. Your Excellency, Governor of Greece, although I am from a different race, religion, I learned to love the diet of the Greeks, and from the beginning of their rebellion, I decided to join them and become their fellow citizen. During the early years, I served under Meletopoulos and received a wound in Mavra Litharia. Later, I served under the famous Karaiskakis and followed him on his campaigns. In the famous Battle of Arachova, I suffered 2 wounds, and after the death of the brave Karaiskakis, I suffered another injury during the Attica campaign under the leadership of Nicolas Zervas. Then, when the corps were organized under Your Excellency, I stayed in the command of Zervas with the rank of a second lieutenant. I was wounded in the leg and right hand in Vonitsa. I went to the Peloponnese to visit the experienced surgeon, Mr. Nikolaos Yatrakos. I stayed with Yatrakos for 9 months, and I spent what I had gathered since the time of the late Karaiskakis in doctors, medicine, and food. After receiving treatment, I returned to my duty and one day sounded the trumpet under the orders of the illustrious commissioner, Count Agustinos, who was present at the time, because I used to be a trumpeter under Karaiskakis. Suddenly, and with much pain, my lungs are crossed, and the wound was renewed. Then, Count Agustinos, with appropriate sympathy, gave me 15 thalers and ordered me to visit an experienced doctor. I went back to Yatrakos and was healed. I reported to the government requesting to be classified among the invalids until I fully recovered. The government heard my request, but they only granted me all in all 40 pennies a month and not 25 thalers and 2 bread a day. My Excellence, my body is full of wounds. My right hand is useless. My skills are known to Your Excellency and your illustrious brothers. I cannot work in any trade, and I have no maintenance. I don't have relatives and friends because I'm diverse in race, religion, and color, alochrous, he says. These 40 pennies are not enough for me. While I am neither a card player, nor a drunkard, nor I do have any other evil habits, I believe that if the government decides to grant me my 25 thalers, it would be an act of dignity and justice in the spirit of Kapodistrias. I respectfully await your response with hopefully expectation and indebtedness. Nafplion, December 16, 1830. The obedient Karagiorgis Habeshi. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very striking paper. We now give the floor to Giorgos Giannikos, who's a primary school teacher and a PhD candidate at the University of the Peloponnese. Giorgos manages also a historical website called Philhellenism of History. Giorgos today is going to talk about Ελληνική Επανάσταση και Αφροαμερικανικός τύπος, η ελληνική στάση της εφημερίδας Freedom's Journal, the Greek Revolution and the African American Press, the Philhellenism of the newspaper Freedom's Journal. Giorgos, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Καλημέρα και από εμένα. Ξεκινώντας, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω όλους τους συντελεστές για το συνέδριο αυτό, τη Βρετανική Σχολή, την Εθνική Βιβλιοθήκη και το Ίδρυμα Σταύρος Νιάρχος. Σήμερα θα σας παρουσιάσω την έρευνά μου σχετικά με την φιλελληνική στάση κατά τη διάρκεια της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, της πρώτης αφροαμερικανικής εφημερίδας στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής, της Freedom's Journal. Ξεκινώντας, να πούμε μερικά λόγια βασικά για την εφημερίδα αυτή, η οποία ξεκίνησε να εκδίδεται στις 16 Μαρτίου του 1827 στη Νέα Υόρκη από δύο γεννημένους απελεύθερους Αφροαμερικανούς, τον Σάμιουελ Κόρνις και τον Τζον Ράσγουρν. Πρόκειται, όπως είπαμε, για την πρώτη αφροαμερικανική εφημερίδα στη ΣΥΠΑ, η οποία κυκλοφόρησε συνολικά 103 φύλλα. Εκδιδότανε μία φορά την εβδομάδα, κάθε Παρασκευή, και διανέμονταν περίπου 800 φύλλα της στη Νέα Υόρκη, αλλά και σε άλλες πολιτείες του Βορρά. Τον Μάρτιο του 1829 σταμάτησε η έκδοσή της εξαιτίας οικονομικών προβλημάτων. Την εφημερίδα απασχόλησαν θέματα όπως ο απικισμός, η μόρφωση, η αυτοβελτίωση, η θέση των γυναικών, η δουλεία και άλλα θέματα. Επίσης, κάλυψε την εξέλιξη διάφορων επαναστάσεων, τόσο στην Αμερικανική όσο και στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ήπειρο, όπως στην Αϊτή, τα πολεμικά γεγονότα στο Μεξικό τη δεκαετία του 1820, αλλά και την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Ας δώσουμε τώρα μερικές πληροφορίες σχετικά με τους λόγους έκδοσης της εφημερίδας. Βασικός στόχος της Freedom's Journal ήταν να διαμορφώσει μια συλλογική κοινωνική ταυτότητα στις αφροαμερικανικές κοινότητες και να αναδείξει σημαντικά προβλήματα που αυτές αντιμετώπιζαν, όπως ο ρατσισμός και η δουλεία. Επίσης, επεδίωκε να απαντήσει σε επικρίσεις και επιθέσεις ορισμένων λευκών εκδοτών εναντίον των Αφροαμερικανών, όπως ήταν ο εκδότης Μορντεκάι Νόα, αλλά και μερικών αμερικανικών εφημερίδων. Η έκδοσή της συνδέεται επιπλέον με την αξία που απέδιδαν οι αφροαμερικανικές κοινότητες του Βορρά στην ανάγνωση και τη γραφή. Τέλος, η κυκλοφορία της είναι αποτέλεσμα της δημοσιογραφικής κουλτούρας που διαμορφώθηκε στα τέλη της δεκαετίας του 1820 σε διάφορες, ας μου επιτραπεί ο όρος, περιθωριοποιημένες κοινωνικές ομάδες. Οι στόχοι της έρευνάς μας. Μέσω της παρούσας έρευνας στοχεύουμε να καταγράψουμε τους τρόπους με τους οποίους εκφράστηκε η φιλελληνική στάση της εφημερίδας και των αρθρογράφων της. Να εξετάσουμε τις αιτίες της στάσης αυτής και τέλος να συσχετίσουμε τα δεδομένα και τις παρατηρήσεις μας με τις κοινωνικοπολιτικές συνθήκες της ΗΠΑ και στην Ελλάδα στο πρώτο μισό του 19ου αιώνα, καθώς και με το ιστορικό πλαίσιο της εποχής. Τα δεδομένα. Το υλικό μας προέρχεται από τα 103 φύλλα της εφημερίδας που κυκλοφόρησαν σε διάστημα 2 χρόνων. Τα φύλλα ανακτήθηκαν από το ψηφιακό αρχείο του Wisconsin Historical Society και συνολικά εντοπίστηκαν 58 κείμενα καταχωρήσεις με φιλελληνικό περιεχόμενο και ενδιαφέρον. Λοιπόν, εδώ έχουμε μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα διαφάνεια στην οποία έχω κατηγοριοποιήσει τις 58 καταγραφές σε 7 θεματικές. Τι άρθρα συναντάμε? Πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις και νέα από την Ελλάδα. Άρθρα για φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Φιλελληνικά ποίηματα. Συναντάμε άρθρα και δημοσιεύσεις με στοιχεία αρχαιολατρείας. Άρθρα που συνέδεαν την Αμερικανική Δουλεία, την αρχαία Ελλάδα και την Ελλάδα γενικότερα και την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Επίσης, κείμενα που παρουσίαζαν τους Τούρκους και τέλος έχουμε κάποια γενικού περιεχομένου κείμενα όπως γράμματα, περιηγητικές καταγραφές και μία διαφήμιση. Μεθοδολογία. Αρχικά έγινε ανάγνωση όλων των φύλων της εφημερίδας, εντοπίστηκαν τα κείμενα που αποτυπώνουν τη φιλελληνική στάση της εφημερίδας, έγινε ομαδοποίηση, κατηγοριοποίηση των κειμένων, αναλύθηκαν τα κείμενα και τέλος έγινε εξαγωγή των συμπερασμάτων. Ως προς τα ερμηνευτικά εργαλεία, χρησιμοποίησαμε την ποιοτική μέθοδο της ανάλυσης λόγου και της κριτικής ανάλυσης λόγου και επικουρικά επιστρατεύτηκε και η περιγραφική στατιστική για την καλύτερη ερμηνεία και πληρέστερη παρουσίαση των δεδομένων. Ξεκινάμε με αυτές τις θεματικές κατηγορίες. Η εφημερίδα φιλοξένησε πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις και νέα από την Ελλάδα. Οι ειδήσεις δεν προέρχονταν από άμεσους απεσταλμένους της εφημερίδας στην Ελλάδα. Η Freedom's Journal είτε να δημοσίευε άρθρα από ευρωπαϊκές εφημερίδες που έφταναν στην Αμερική, είτε σχολίαζε η ίδια τα άρθρα τα οποία έβρισκαν οι συντάκτες της. Εδώ έχουμε δύο ενδεικτικά παραδείγματα. Πάνω οι Αφροαμερικανοί μαθαίνουν για τη διάσωση Ελλήνων προσφύγων από το γαλλικό ναυτικό, ενώ κάτω έχουμε μία είδηση σχετικά με την άφιξη και την καλλιέργεια της πατάτας στα ελληνικά νησιά. Ιδιαίτερη βαρύτητα δόθηκε στην κάλυψη της ναυμαχίας του Ναβαρίνου. Οι Αφροαμερικανοί μαθαίνουν για την ναυμαχία του Ναβαρίνου τον Δεκέμβριο του 1827 και δημοσιεύονται 3 κείμενα, 3 αφιερώματα. Το πρώτο, το οποίο σας δείχνω εδώ αριστερά, αποτελεί μία αναδημοσίευση που μας πληροφορεί για την καταστροφή του τουρκοαιγυπτιακού στόλου και ένα πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον είναι το δεύτερο, στο οποίο αρθρογράφος της Freedom's Journal, δεν πρόκειται για αναδημοσίευση, συγκρίνει την ναυμαχία του Ναβαρίνου με εκείνη της Σαλαμίνας. Άρθρα για φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Φιλοξενούνται μέσα στην εφημερίδα μικρά αφιερώματα σχετικά με φιλελληνικές πρωτοβουλίες στην Αμερική αλλά και στην Ευρώπη. Μαθαίνουμε για την αποστολή ιατροφαρμακευτικού υλικού, τροφίμων, ρουχισμού, χρημάτων από την Αμερική στην Ελλάδα. Εδώ έχουμε 4 χαρακτηριστικά παραδείγματα, κείμενα. Πάνω αριστερά έχουμε μία αφροαμερικανική χωροεσπερίδα στη Νέα Υόρκη, η οποία λέει ότι συγκέντρωσε 600 Αφροαμερικανούς και διήρκησε μέχρι τις 6 ώρα το πρωί. Δεξιά πάνω έχουμε τη δωρεά ενός ασημένιου ρολογιού από ένα 12χρονο αγόρι για τις ανάγκες του ελληνικού αγώνα. Κάτω αριστερά βλέπουμε μία είδηση σχετικά με μία συγκέντρωση στη Νέα Υόρκη για την ενίσχυση των Ελλήνων και επίσης κάτω δεξιά στη Μασαχουσέτη έχουμε συγκέντρωση ρούχων και χρημάτων για τον ελληνικό αγώνα. Φιλελληνικά ποίηματα. Τον πρώτο χρόνο κυκλοφορίας της εφημερίδας φιλοξενήθηκαν στην τελευταία της σελίδα, την 4η, 4 φιλελληνικά ποίηματα. Κάποια από αυτά στο τέλος υπογράφονταν με αρχαιοελληνικά ψευδόνυμα όπως Αρίων ή Σιμονίδης. Το πρώτο δημοσιεύτηκε το Μάρτιο του 1827, λέγεται «Γκρίς». Ο ποιητής απευθύνεται στην Ελλάδα και λέει ότι έχει φτάσει η στιγμή της εξέγερσης. Γίνεται αναφορά στους περσικούς πολέμους και στην άμυνα της Ελλάδας. Και τέλος υπάρχει ένας έντονος τόνος αρχαιολατρείας στο ποίημα. Το δεύτερο ποίημα είναι το «The Janissary Song», που μιλάει για τον σώμα των γενίτσαρων, μιλάει ένας εξ ονόματων όλων και εκφράζουν σε αυτό οι γενίτσαροι το θυμό τους και την οργή τους για τον Μαχμούντ, τον οποίον το θεωρούν τύραννο και τον οποίο ορκίζονται να σκοτώσουν. Πρώτο τελευταίο ποίημα, το Greek Song, στο οποίο ο ποιητής απευθύνεται σε ένα ανώνυμο Έλληνα στρατιώτη και του ζητάει να ακολουθήσει το παράδειγμα του Καραϊσκάκη. Δεν πρόκειται για αναδημοσιεύσεις ποιημάτων, πρόκειται για ποίηματα που γράφανε Αφροαμερικανοί συντάκτες. Για τον ποιητή η αναμέτρηση δεν είναι εύκολη. Οι Έλληνες θα αντιμετωπίσουν δυσκολίες, αλλά θα πρέπει να πολεμήσουν. Και όλη η Ελληνική Επανάσταση θυμίζει στον ποιητή ένα νέο μαραθώνα. Τελευταίο ποίημα, τον Οκτώβριο του 1827, είναι το ποίημα του Γκρίς, στο οποίο γίνεται επίκληση σε ηρωικά πρόσωπα, όπως ο Λεωνίδας, οι ήρωες του Μαραθώνα, ο Πλάτωνας. Ο ποιητής καλεί τους Έλληνες να αγωνιστούν και να πεθάνουν αν χρειαστεί, παρά να παραμείνουν δούλοι. Τέλος, εκφράζει την ελπίδα ότι οι αγώνες αυτοί δεν θα ξεχαστούν και ότι η χώρα θα φτάσει πάλι στην παλιά της δόξα. Έχουμε επίσης άρθρα και δημοσιεύσεις με στοιχεία αρχαιολατρείας. Δημοσιεύονται άρθρα που αναφέρονται σε αρχαιοελληνικές παραδόσεις, όπως για τον έρωτα, τον θρήνο, το γάμο στην αρχαία Ελλάδα. Εντοπίζονται κείμενα που υπογράφονται με αρχαιοελληνικά ψευδόνυμα. Κάτω δεξιά υπογράφεται με το Αριστίδης. Επίσης, έχουμε αποσπάσματα από τα ηθικά, εδώ είναι λάθος, δεν είναι κομμάτια, από τα ηθικά σκέτο του Πλουτάρχου. Ή επίσης αφιερώματα στον Όμηρο για τον βίο, τη δράση, τα αποφθέγματα σημαντικών αρχαίων Ελλήνων. Ένα από τα πιο ενδιαφέροντα κειμενικά είδη που συναντάμε, καταχωρήσεις, είναι άρθρα τα οποία συσχέτιζαν την Αμερικανική Δουλεία, την Ελλάδα, πιο συγκεκριμένα την αρχαία Ελλάδα, και την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Όταν φιλοξενούνται μέσα στην εφημερίδα άρθρα που μιλάνε για το ρατσισμό και τη δουλεία. Για να εξηγηθεί το φαινόμενο γίνεται ιστορική αναδρομή στο παρελθόν, στην αρχαιότητα. Η δουλεία στην Αμερική όμως συγκρίνεται και με τη δουλεία που υφίστανται οι Έλληνες στον Οθωμανικό κόσμο. Εντοπίζονται ομοιότητες και διαφορές. Σε αυτό εδώ το άρθρο γίνεται σύγκριση ανάμεσα στην Αμερικανική και Οθωμανική δουλεία. Ο συντάκτης είναι Αφροαμερικανός, λέει ότι είναι καλύτερο να είσαι Έλληνας παρά Αφροαμερικανός, γιατί οι Έλληνες μέσω του αγώνα τους έχουν και μια ελπίδα να ελευθερωθούν. Ενώ μια τέτοια ελπίδα δεν διαφαίνεται για τους Αφροαμερικανούς. Όμως, και είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον εδώ, επικρίθηκε, έχουμε μια επίκριση για την υποκριτική στάση μιας μερίδας λευκών στην Αμερική, που ενώ από τη μία πλευρά ενδιαφερότανε για τις τύχες των υπόδουλων Ελλήνων, την ίδια στιγμή αδιαφορούσε και έκλεινε τα μάτια στις συνθήκες ζωής των Αφροαμερικανών στην Αμερική. Εδώ υπάρχει ένα κείμενο, μία επιστολή ενός Αφροαμερικανού αναγνώστη, ο οποίος κάνει μία επίθεση στους λευκούς ιεραποστόλους, που ενώ βοηθάνε τους Έλληνες σκλάβους, την ίδια στιγμή αδιαφορούν για τους δούλους στην Αμερική. Επίσης, έχουμε κείμενα στα οποία παρουσιάζονται οι Τούρκοι. Η εικόνα των Τούρκων σχηματίζεται μέσω αναδημοσίευσης, αποσπασμάτων, λογοτεχνικών έργων, ειδήσεων, περιηγητικών καταγραφών, βιογραφιών πολιτικών προσώπων. Οι Τούρκοι προβάλλονται αρνητικά ως ένας λαός με σκληρούς νόμους και με μια κοσμοθεωρία, ας το πούμε, ξένη από αυτή του δυτικού κόσμου. Χαρακτηρίζονται ως η φιλοσοφία τους έτσι βάρβαρη. Η εφημερίδα παρουσιάζει επίσης και τη δεινή θέση της γυναίκας στον Οθωμανικό κόσμο, αφού οι γυναίκες δεν έχουν τα ίδια δικαιώματα με τους άνδρες. Εδώ δύο χαρακτηριστικά παραδείγματα. Στο πρώτο, το οποίο αναφέρει για την καύση, για την πυρπόληση ενός ζωντανού αγγελιοφόρου στη πόλη Μπάσρα, και δεξιά, με τίτλο Turkish Women, ένα άρθρο που παρουσιάζει τις γυναίκες στην Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία, τις χαρακτηρίζει περιορισμένες, ότι δεν έχουν δικαιώματα, ότι δεν μπορούν να βγουν έξω από το σπίτι χωρίς τη συνοδεία άνδρα, δεν μπορούν να μιλήσουν χωρίς την έγκριση των ανδρών. Τέλος, έχουμε γενικού περιεχομένου κείμενα, τα οποία είναι τρία συνολικά, τρεις καταγραφές. Η μία είναι περιηγητική καταγραφή, η άλλη είναι γράμμα και η τρίτη είναι έκπληξη. Στην επόμενη διαφάνεια την εμφανίζω. Είναι εδώ τον δεύτερο χρόνο κυκλοφορίας και για αρκετά φύλλα δημοσιευόταν μία διαφήμιση αφροαμερικανικού εκπαιδευτικού σεμιναρίου στην Βαλτιμόρη. Ο καθηγητής ήταν ο William Lively, έχω βρει και κάποιες πληροφορίες σχετικά με αυτόν, ο οποίος δίδασκε πολλά μαθήματα και ήταν πρωτοποριακό εκείνο το σεμινάριο, γιατί απευθυνόταν και στα δύο φύλλα, απευθυνόταν σε Αφροαμερικανούς και μεταξύ των γλωσσών, αν δείτε εδώ, διδάσκονταν και ελληνικές γλώσσες, η ελληνική γλώσσα. Οι παρατηρήσεις μας. Από τις συνολικά 58 καταγραφές, καταχωρήσεις φιλελληνικού ενδιαφέροντος, η πλειοψηφία αφορά πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις και φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Το πρώτο έτος σημειώνονται περισσότερες καταγραφές. Έχουμε 37 από τις 58 σε σχέση με το δεύτερο, που είναι σχεδόν οι μισές, 21. Σε αυτήν εδώ την πίτα παρουσιάζεται η ποσόστοση των κειμενικών ειδών, δηλαδή οι 58 καταγραφές, τι ποσοστό καταλαμβάνουν. Οι πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις είναι 16, οι φιλελληνικές δράσεις είναι 12, τα κείμενα αρχαιολατρείας 10 και έπονται και τα υπόλοιπα. Εδώ άλλη μία διαφάνεια που δείχνει σύγκριση των φιλελληνικών καταγραφών ανά έτος. Το πρώτο έτος έχουμε περισσότερες σε σχέση με το δεύτερο. Συγκρίνουμε εδώ πέρα τα πρώτα δύο κειμενικά είδη, τις πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις και τα άρθρα με φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Βλέπουμε ότι το πρώτο έτος οι πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις ήταν περισσότερες από τις φιλελληνικές δράσεις, από τα κείμενα που περιέγραφαν φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Το σκηνικό όμως και το οποίο αντιστρέφεται το δεύτερο έτος, που ενώ βλέπουμε ότι θα έχουμε μια θετική έκβαση της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, μειώνονται οι στρατιωτικές και πολεμικές επιχειρήσεις, μειώνονται οι πολεμικές ανταποκρίσεις μέσα στην εφημερίδα και αυξάνονται τα κείμενα που μιλάνε για τις φιλελληνικές δράσεις. Αυτή εδώ είναι μια ενδιαφέρουσα διαφάνεια, η οποία θα μας βοηθήσει και για τα συμπεράσματα. Βλέπουμε, χωρίσαμε τις φιλελληνικές καταγραφές, καταχωρήσεις, τα φιλελληνικά κείμενα ανά εξάμηνο. Και παρατηρούμε ότι ενώ το πρώτο εξάμηνο έχουμε 21 κείμενα με φιλελληνικό ενδιαφέρον, το τελευταίο εξάμηνο έχουμε μόλις 8. Άρα φαίνεται ότι το ενδιαφέρον της εφημερίδας για τον ελληνικό αγώνα φθήνει. Στα συμπεράσματά μας, ας προχωρήσουμε τώρα και να τελειώσουμε. Ο φιλελληνισμός της ΗΠΑ, και αυτό θέλαμε να δείξουμε μέσα από αυτή την έρευνα, είναι ότι δεν αφορά μόνο λευκούς Αμερικανούς που στήριξαν τον αγώνα, είτε πολιτικούς, στρατιωτικούς, φιλανθρώπους. Αλλά ούτε μόνο τα κομιτάτα. Εκφράστηκε και μέσω του αφροαμερικανικού τύπου. Οι Αφροαμερικανοί ενημερώνονταν τακτικά για τον ελληνικό απελευθερητικό αγώνα και αυτό δείχνει αφενός το ενδιαφέρον της ίδιας της διεύθυνσης της εφημερίδας και αφετέρου το ενδιαφέρον του αναγνωστικού κοινού. Αν δεν ενδιαφερόταν το αναγνωστικό κοινό, δεν θα έβρισκε, φαντάζομαι, θέση και η Ελληνική Επανάσταση μέσα στα φύλλα της εφημερίδας. Η φιλελληνική στάση της εφημερίδας εκφράστηκε ποικιλοτρόπως, όπως μέσω άρθρων, ανταποκρίσεων, ποιημάτων. Ας το συγκρίνουμε αυτό και με ορισμένες ευρωπαϊκές εφημερίδες, οι οποίες κάναν απλή αναδημοσίευση αφιερωμάτων, άρθρων για την Ελληνική Επανάσταση, που τα εντόπισαν κυρίως βρετανικές και γερμανικές εφημερίδες. Εδώ έχουμε άρθρα, όχι απλά που αναδημοσιεύονται, και τα οποία συντάσσονται από τους ίδιους τους Αφροαμερικανούς. Ο φιλελληνισμός δεν εκδηλώθηκε όμως μόνο μέσω της θετικής προβολής των Ελλήνων και του αγώνα τους, αλλά και μέσω της αρνητικής προβολής των Οθωμανών. Το φιλελληνικό ενδιαφέρον είδαμε ότι ήταν εντονότερο κατά το πρώτο έτος και ιδιαίτερα κατά την περίοδο πριν και μετά την αυμαχία του Ναβαρίνου. Όσο διαφαινόταν όμως η επιτυχής έκβαση της Επανάστασης, το ενδιαφέρον άρχιζε να φθήνει και περιορίστηκε σε απλή καταγραφή φιλελληνικών δράσεων. Τέλος, ο αγώνας των Ελλήνων για την ελευθερία τους συνδέθηκε με εκείνον των Αφροαμερικανών για κατάργηση της δουλείας, abolitionism. Η στήριξη προς τους Έλληνες έδειχνε το δρόμο και εμέσως έδινε θάρρος στους Αφροαμερικανούς ώστε να αγωνιστούν για τα δικά τους δικαιώματα. Ωστόσο, όπως είδαμε, επικρίθηκε η υποκριτική στάση μιας μερίδας ενός τμήματος της αμερικανικής κοινωνίας που ενώ στο εξωτερικό ενδιαφερόταν για τις τύχες των υπόδουλων Ελλήνων, στο εσωτερικό αδιαφορούσε πλήρως για τις συνθήκες ζωής των υπόδουλων Αφροαμερικανών. Αυτή είναι η βιογραφία που χρησιμοποίησα για την έρευνα αυτή. Να ευχαριστήσω την κυρία Λία Μεταξά για τη μετάφραση των φιλελληνικών ποιημάτων. Ορισμένα στοιχεία επικοινωνίας σε περίπτωση που κάποιος θέλει να έρθει σε επαφή μαζί μου. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you very much. We now move to the third paper of this panel by Alasdair Grant, who is a research associate in the Emmy Noether Junior Research Group entitled Social Context of Rebellion in the Early Islamic Period at the University of Hamburg, specializing in Armenia under caliphal rule. Alasdair previously curated an exhibition entitled Edina Athena, the Greek Revolution and the Athens of the North, 1821-2021, sponsored by the Leventis Foundation at the University of Edinburgh. And today he's going to tell us about Thomas Gordon, Philhellenism and slavery. Alasdair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Michalis, for very kindly inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. This is one of these papers that was discussed in the introduction that will be micro-historical in its approach and will delve deep into the past of one individual Philhellene to discuss a wider theme. But in line with the global canvas of this conference, I'd like to start halfway across the world in Jamaica with another movement for freedom. This was the Baptist or Sam Sharp Rebellion that took place in the western parishes of Jamaica in Christmas 1831 and 1831 and the first days of January 1832. The causes of this rebellion were the news of the accelerated movement for the abolition of slavery within the British Empire, that was taken to mean that slavery had in fact already been abolished by that autumn. Missionary movements within the island of Jamaica provided a focal point for enslaved people to meet and discuss ideas for political motivation and movement. The rebellion took the course of a series of strikes, people downing tools and refusing to work, the destruction of property, principally through fires, and also paramilitary activity involving the organization of a battalion of enslaved people. There were thousands of people involved in this conflict, and over the course of the conflict, at least 207 enslaved people are recorded as having been killed in action. After the conflict was concluded in the favor of the colonial authorities, there were 626 people tried, of whom 312 were executed. Now, of those who were court-martialed but actually not executed were 5 on an estate in Trelawney Parish called Georgia. These people were condemned to a workhouse for life. These were people on the estate of Thomas Gordon of Buffalo and Cairns, the famous Scottish Philhellene who lived right in the very northeast tip of Scotland. He was the only surviving heir of the landed aristocrat Charles Gordon and his wife Christian. Now, he inherited Cairns Estate and Georgia Estate in Scotland and Jamaica, respectively, upon the death of his father, and this made him among the 25 richest landowners in that county in Scotland at the time. But it is important to mention that he was not actually a member of the nobility. He was not a lord or anything like this. He was just somebody who possessed land and was very wealthy. He was educated in some typical establishment places: Eton, Marshall College in Aberdeen, now part of the University of Aberdeen, and the University of Oxford. Interestingly, he was born in the same year as Lord Byron, grew up only a few miles away from him, but despite being in Greece on grand tour at exactly the same time as him in 1810, they actually never really seem to have met, so far as we know. He had a military career fighting for the Scots Greys. He then moved to serve Russia and Mecklenburg, and then held intelligence and military roles during the Napoleonic period, none of which were for Britain. He was married to Barbara Kana Dahachko, who was an Armenian of Constantinople, but had no children by her, and his only surviving child was an illegitimate son, James Wilkinson Gordon. This is an image that I suspect no one in this room will have seen before. This is a pair of small paintings of the couple, Thomas and Barbara, painted supposedly in 1822, probably during the time of Gordon's return from Greece after his first time there, while they were in Paris, today held in Aberdeen. Gordon's involvement in Greece is probably well known to many of you here, but on the off chance that some of you are unfamiliar with it, I thought I would go through some of the key stages. He was chef d'état-major for Demetrios Ypsilantis in Tripolitsa. He served in that campaign and left at the end of that campaign for complex reasons that actually to be a bit cheeky that I discuss in another paper that's forthcoming. So there is some more research being done on Gordon's motivations for coming to and leaving Greece during the revolution. He was engaged in Philhellenic activities while he was in Britain after the Tripolitsa campaign, both a member of the London Greek Committee and also a founding member of a lesser-known committee in Aberdeen. He then returned to Greece to participate in the efforts to relieve the Ottoman siege of the Acropolis in 1827, after which he once more left for Scotland. He lived in Argos for 3 years, where he worked as an archaeologist uncovering the temple of Hera. And then towards the end of the revolution wrote his famous history, for which he is probably best known today, which you will notice was written at exactly the same time as the Baptist or Sam Sharp rebellion was occurring in Jamaica. He did return to Greece. He campaigned with George Finlay, whose papers were mentioned earlier, in the 1830s in what was then the north of the Greek state. In his own writings, by which I'm referring to his history here, Gordon discusses two distinctive types of slavery or enslavement. So there is the discourse of the enslavement of the Greek nation as a whole, which is not about the literal enslavement of individuals, but about an idea of political subservience. He uses terms that will be very familiar to many of you, the Mussulman yoke, the idea that this situation of political subordination had left a mark on the character of the inhabitants, a form of mishellenism or also a form of xenophobia or racism in itself. He describes the taint of slavery supposedly within the Greek people not soon to be effaced, and talks of the Greeks as men nursed in slavery who in battle made petty calculations of gain and loss. So make no mistake, this is somebody who has wide-ranging prejudices. He does also record episodes of literal enslavement, which will likely all be familiar to you. The horrendous massacre in Chios in 1822, and then campaigns in Crete and southern Greece in the following years. So there are two different strands to what he's discussing in his history. To try to put these into context, and some of these themes have already been put into context by the previous speakers, in late Ottoman practices of slavery, there were widely two groups by this time. The first group being people from sub-Saharan Africa who were trafficked into these sorts of hard labor, domestic or agricultural labor. And then on the other hand, Circassians and people from Georgia who tended more to have palatines, that is palace-based positions or military positions, and had more opportunities for rising up the social hierarchy. Now, if we then look at the other side of this context of Philhellenism and slavery, the involvement of Philhellenes in the abolitionist movement, Thomas Gordon was actually in the circle of some prominent abolitionists within Scotland, and I pick out two here who were involved in abolitionist societies in Edinburgh. One, Thomas McCree, who was one of the first people to speak at a public meeting on behalf of supporting the Greek independence in the whole of the United Kingdom, and Agnes Renton, a little-known figure who was a philanthropist who supported various causes, emancipation, Philhellenism, also the idea that Catholics should have the same rights in Britain as Protestants, which actually Thomas McCree did not believe in. And in this context, there was a growing charge of hypocrisy, which I will come back to at the end, the idea that the fact that Britain could continue supporting the institution of plantation slavery within its empire while simultaneously using discourses of slavery to support the political emancipation of Greece was hypocritical. And of course, this was something that was happening in America and Britain simultaneously. So, upon Charles Gordon's death, Gordon inherited Georgia Estate in Jamaica. Charles Gordon did not have a long life. He was born in the middle of the 18th century and, as mentioned earlier, left Thomas as his only heir. Now, Jamaica's Chief Justice, John Grant, not so far as I know a relative of mine, had acquired an estate in 1778 for this rather large sum of £28,000. Now, he transferred his share to Gordon and then left Charles with this large estate, which Charles then entrusted to John's brother Francis to manage, while Charles returned to Scotland and never came back to Jamaica. So what happened was that in the late 18th century, this estate was acquired, but then a situation of absentee ownership was set up. And for the rest of its history, more or less, with the exception of some visits in the late 19th century, this estate was always managed in absentia. So it was fairly complex financially. Charles Gordon entered into debt on his Scottish estates. He pumped more money into Georgia Estate in Jamaica. But the returns of this estate varied. So sometimes they made a loss. Towards the end of the century, they started to make profits again. And in response to this, Charles decided to try to, or rather Francis Grant, with Charles's permission, decided to plough yet more money into expanding the estate, which was considered to be the best way to increase profits, but in fact meant that it was very unlikely that anyone else was ever going to buy it off them because it had become such a large financial concern. So this potentially volatile plantation is what Thomas Gordon inherited on his father's death. What Thomas himself had to do with this estate is something for which we have only indirect evidence. And this takes the form of some letters from somebody who seems to have been his mentor as a young man, who was the local Presbyterian minister. So Lonmay is the parish in which Cairness House is located, a man called Charles Gibbon. And there are a couple of letters that I picked out here from Thomas Gordon's personal papers. The first one in 1809 was written when Gordon was stationed as part of the Scots Greys in Dublin, and it indicates that Gordon had expressed his wish to get a military transfer to Jamaica. Now, it's not explicitly stated, but it's almost certain that that's because he wanted to attend to Georgia Estate when he was there. And then 1 year later, by the time that he had got the money together to go on grand tour, Gibbon wrote to him again when he was in Malta. And in that letter, he said that Gordon should not consider the emancipation of those enslaved to him on Georgia Estate until the whole legal context of slavery within the British Empire should change. And here are some quotations from that letter just to show you the sort of ways that Gibbon discussed this. He said, "In an imperfect state like this, i.e. the British Empire allowing slavery, there are many irregularities over which individual public virtue is of no avail." He said that Providence, so the divine order of things, has suffered things to be in such a state, and our Saviour, God, has been silent. So, in response, order that your slaves be well treated and made as comfortable as possible, but do not consider freeing them. So this is from an ordained minister. And I think something that's very striking is how this language of lack of personal efficacy over larger systemic issues is something that is really ingrained into dealing with a lot of social injustices. And of course, the reality is that Gordon could have done something about this. There were a few people who did at this time, although usually it resulted in a situation where people were kept on at very low wages in the same plantation in which they had been enslaved. So it does seem that early in his life, Gordon had expressly considered the possibility of manumitting those enslaved to him on Georgia Estate, but there is no evidence after 1810 that he ever returned to that question. In fact, there is no direct evidence of him ever taking an active interest in the plantation again. It simply remained in his ownership. So the question of how much money Gordon actually made from the institution of slavery is very, very difficult to ascertain. So as mentioned, Gordon, like his father and indeed his son, managed the estate in absentia, and he did this through a person called Patrick Waugh, who was his manager, as Francis Grant had been for his father. For the period of the Revolution, I've found it almost impossible to work out what the returns were on the estate. And it's only when an inquiry was made into the terms of Gordon's will, because of his illegitimate son, that some precise data was assembled as to what the financial returns on Georgia were. So in 1849, this document says that the plantation was returning £500 a year. But this must be some sort of historical estimate, because the same document says that there had been a deficit of over £800 that had been racked up over the 1840s. So the plantation was now working to a loss. But if you consider how much money Gordon was actually taking in from his Scottish concerns, you'll see that he was getting £130 a year from fishing rights and £2,200 a year on the rent of cottages on his Scottish estates. So this does seem to be very much a problematic financial concern, the estate at this point. But again, during the revolutionary period before abolition, the situation may have been different. In the period of the revolution, the number of people enslaved on Georgia estate ranged, it was round about 250. So this is a sort of medium-sized estate. But the important thing to remember is that regardless of what the returns were from one year to the next, the institution of slavery created a sense of social privilege that meant that the Gordon family was able to maintain a certain standing within Scottish civil and political life that they would not necessarily have been able to do without that additional concern in the empire. So I now return to the Baptist rebellion that I started with. What were the results of this rebellion? Well, first of all, it provoked a backlash against the many preachers in Jamaica. So these were white British preachers who were seen to be accomplices in helping this rebellion to happen because of their preaching of the equality of mankind. It polarized debate in Britain about abolition. Some people said this is exactly the reason why you cannot abolish slavery, because it will lead to more of these sorts of rebellions. Other people said this is precisely the reason you should deal with this issue now. But ultimately, it led to the quicker abolition of slavery. As mentioned before, this was precisely the time that Gordon was involved in his historiographical project, and there's no evidence that he directly responded himself to the rebellion. This would have been carried out by his attorney. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery in the Caribbean, in the Cape Colony, and in Mauritius, and gave out compensation to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of pounds to its subjects who had owned enslaved people. Gordon himself received over £5,000 in 1835, and if you're interested, you can visit the University College of London website, Legacies of British Slavery, where you can see all of these claims laid out, address for address, across the country. This led to the introduction of the so-called apprenticeship system. So this is a period during which formerly enslaved people were bound to an estate for a defined period of time and had to work for low wages. And therefore declining returns on the plantation. But as with many people of this era, he started putting money into other imperial concerns as well, in Pennsylvania and also in Australasian investment companies. Georgia estate itself seems to have remained in the Gordon family until the end of the century. There are certainly papers up to 1895 recording visits and the management of the estate. So to conclude, what has this paper done? Well, it's recovered a vital but very little acknowledged part of Gordon's biography. If you look up the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry for Gordon, you'll find absolutely no mention of the fact that he owned an estate in Jamaica, of the fact that he owned enslaved people, of any financial benefit that accrued to the family because of this. He is, of course, though, just one example, and I cannot make claims for the Philhellenic movement as a whole, but merely state that this is one individual who was involved in enslavement, and I hope that this will be a prompt to other people working on Philhellenism and Philhellenes to look into possible contexts of imperialism and slavery within these individuals' backgrounds. I think it's an interesting counterpoint to the American narrative, which is at this stage much more prominent. There's perhaps a tendency to think in the post-Wilberforce period, after the slave trade has been abolished within the British Empire, that this is a settled debate. But of course, during the period of the Greek Revolution, it's not a settled debate in Britain because abolition itself has not yet occurred. And the parallel of these two insurrections within Jamaica and Greece is very striking. I'd like to finish with a quotation from a female English abolitionist, Elizabeth Hayrick, and I will just read this quotation to you, where she remarks on the hypocrisy of Philhellenes who are involved in plantation slavery. How preposterously partial, she says, and inconsistent are we in the extension of our sympathy, our approbation and our assistance towards the oppressed and miserable. We extol the resistance of the Greeks. We deem it heroic and meritorious. We deem it an act of virtue, of Christian charity, to support them with arms and munition, to enable them to persist in insurrection. Possibly, in the longest list of munificent subscribers to these Greek insurgents, the names of some noble lords and honourable gentlemen may be found, who sanction and approve the visitation of West Indian slave insurgents with the gibbet and the infliction of 1,000 lashes. Whether she knew of Gordon's case or not, I don't know, but the last point that I would like to leave you with is that it leaves open this question of the sort of racialized hierarchies that were involved in things like British Philhellenism within an imperialist context, the idea of whose freedom and whose lives are worth more than others. It's a very uncomfortable story, but it's one that I think this panel is going a long way to unpick. So thank you very much.